Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy's policy team. My name is Isabel Lord, and I'm the Advocacy Coordinator here at RTC. Our mission at Rails to Trails Conservancy is to build a nation connected by trails and reimagine public spaces to create safe ways for everyone to walk, bike, and be active outdoors. We advocate for trail and active transportation networks because of their numerous benefits to communities, including increased transportation options for those who do not or choose not to drive, economic revitalization, increased quality of life, reduced emissions, and equitable access to everyday destinations through increased community connectivity. Our topic for today is taking advantage of dedicated active transportation connectivity funding. We have 800 registrations for this webinar, which shows a huge interest in this topic, and we are super excited to share more. During this webinar, you will learn more about applying for the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, otherwise known as ATIIP, which will open for applications this winter. This new competitive funding program, which was created as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BILL, is the new federal program dedicated solely to the development of connected walking and biking routes within and between communities. Stick around to learn tips from RTC and partners for taking advantage of this opportunity and perspectives on the importance of having a dedicated funding source for connected trail and active transportation networks. Before I hand it over to our first presenter, I want to take a moment to go through some brief housekeeping and introduce our panelists. We'll save time for questions at the end. If you have any questions about our resources or other content you'll hear about in the presentation, please type them in the question and answer box on the right-hand side of your screen at any time. If you have specific and more detailed technical assistance questions, please contact us via the link in the chat and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Finally, after today's webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email containing a quick survey about today's webinar, more information about RTC's policy work, and a recording of today's webinar. Today, you will hear from RTC's very own Senior Strategist for Policy Advocacy, Marianne Fowler, and RTC's Vice President of Policy, Kevin Mills. We are thrilled to also be joined by Jackson Lee from Missoula County Parks, Trails, and Open Lands, and Amanda Cooley from Powell County, Montana. Jackson is the Parks and Trails Project Specialist for Missoula County Parks, Trails, and Open Lands. He has spent the past decade planning and leading community-driven recreation projects and stewardship programs on public lands. In his role with Missoula County, he is one of the architects of a regional trail coalition, facilitates a matching grants program focused on creating and enhancing rural recreation opportunities, and collaborates with community partners on playgrounds to skate parks and everything in between. Amanda Cooley is the Planning Director for Powell County, Montana. In this role, she oversees trail planning and development, which includes securing resources, guiding project development, and aligning intersecting transportation priorities through close coordination with local, regional, and federal organizations. In 2023, she oversaw the completion of 10 miles of new trail along the Great American Rail Trail alignment. Currently, she is co-leading a regional trail coalition that spans over 260 linear miles, represents 7 local government jurisdictions, and includes representatives from several local nonprofit partners. With that, I'll hand it off to RTC Senior Strategist for Policy Advocacy, Marianne Fowler.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you, Isabel, and thank you all for joining us. The huge turnout for this webinar is so affirming to the work that we all do, so we're really glad to have you here. I'm going to touch just briefly on the history and trajectory of the federal funding role in promoting and creating infrastructure for walking and biking and active transportation in our country. By way of context, ATIIP didn't just fall from the policy sky. It would be nice if we had such occasions, but instead it's a natural extension of an intentional and strategic approach to using federal funds as a tool for advancing walking and biking in America's communities. Prior to 1992, with the exception of Colorado, there were no federal transportation dollars used or applied to walking and biking and infrastructure. But that changed with the passage of transportation law in 1991, because RTC and partners perceived that we would never have the infrastructure that we needed so that people could choose to walk and bike if they wanted to, unless we had a federal role in that and created a federal partner. So ICE-T, which passed, as I said, in 1991, became effective in 92, created the Transportation Enhancements Program, little p, which created dedicated funding for projects that enhanced communities, including walking and biking and infrastructure. And the response was overwhelming. I mean, all over the country, applicants just flowed into the states that had told us that they knew that no one in their state was even interested in such a thing, called in a frantic, what are we going to do with all these applications that we have? So we were really quite heady. But it's really key to focus on the language there. The transportation enhancements and later transportation alternatives was very project focused. And the program itself is sub-allocated from the federal level to the state level. And then from the state level, a lot of the money, as you all know, goes on down to the community level. So we end up with fairly small grants. And the question becomes, how can we build a system if we only have small grants that are project-based? So in addressing that conundrum, after the huge success of TE, RTC and partners said, well, what would happen if we had large focus investments on individual communities with this express purpose of connecting the projects that exist there, and again, for the purpose of creating a network, and see if that can carry a part of the transportation load. And so we got the non-motorized transportation pilot program in the Safety Lieu transportation legislation in 2005. And it identified 4 communities, each of which eventually received $28 million to invest in a way to accomplish just those things. We could have the slide on that there we go. Those were the 4 communities: Columbia, Missouri, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, Sheboygan County, Marin County, Minneapolis. The results were astounding. The increase of pedestrian trips was 22.8%, bicycle trips 48.3%, vehicle miles averted 85.1 million vehicle miles averted over that time period where the investment was going in. It's the only example we've had where we actually measured walking and biking before an investment was made, measured it all on the way, and then measured the impact at the end. And so it was a huge success. And so RTC, again, and partners began to try to craft legislation that would institutionalize the approach of the non-motorized pilot program. And it's taken us all this time, but we're in Bill, as Isabel said, when Bill passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, we got the active transportation infrastructure investment program into law. As you all know, it's not been launched yet, and it's not funded for the level at which we want it. And those are our 2 foci right now. And so that's what a lot of what this webinar is all about, is getting y'all ready to take advantage of it. But it's an exciting time for active transportation. And before I pass it on to Kevin Mills for details on just how the law is structured, we would be remiss if we didn't thank our ATIIP congressional champions. There they are on the screen. If you're in those states, do take a moment to thank them. And if you're not, just thank them anyway. But we would not be where we are without them. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Marianne. So we're waiting with bated breath for the first call for proposals for the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program. Federal Highway Administration promises that it'll come this quarter, inviting local, regional, state, and tribal governments to apply for $45 million in total funding this round. RTC recently identified more than 150 networks that are under development, and we know that there are many more out there around the country. This program is tailor-made to help meet this growing demand for connectivity. So the program is going to support 2 kinds of connectivity. The first one is networks. So here you've got a picture of the circuit in the Philadelphia-Camden region, which is over an 800-mile trail system serving that metropolitan area, and with a focused effort to really try and fill in the gaps and make that a really functional system. So that's just an example of a network. And then, so these are about connecting people to destinations within a region, like workplaces, schools, shops, and services. And networks are required by this law for at least 30% of the construction grants to flow to this network context. The other kind of connectivity is spines. So spines connect between communities or even between states. And in the case of the Great American Rail Trail, eventually all across the country. And so that interstate connectivity, that intercommunity connectivity we call spines, and it is in the law, called that in the law. And this is often via multi-use trails. And the law also requires at least 30% of the funding to go to these kinds of projects. And then finally, there's a minimum of $3 million that'll be awarded in this round for connectivity planning, planning and design. So, okay, so the next thing I want to cover is the legislated criteria that'll be factors in how Federal Highway Administration evaluating elements for you. So the first, of course, is connectivity, as we just defined it. Thinking about how are you filling gaps, how are you expanding access. A second is community support. They'll want to see that you sought public input, that you took that into account, built public support, and that local officials are on board. Things like support letters from elected officials, can go a long way with these applications. Then there's also a commitment to increase walking and biking for the jurisdictions that are applying. So this could be exhibited in a number of ways, like safety policies or community design elements or what have you. Another element is a match. So there is in the law an exemption for low-income communities to not need to provide a match for the federal dollars, but usually they are subject to the typical 80% federal, 20% state or local match requirement. Then equity is critical to this program. This is exhibited by things like addressing disparities in both fatalities and serious injuries to pedestrians based upon and bicyclists based upon race or income, things like access to opportunity. And then finally, it will be important to speak to the benefits of your project across a number of different policy arenas, everything from mobility to the environment and safety and all of these things. So in addition to those legislative criteria, I want to make some predictions about how you can make your application competitive. And these are predictions that I'm pretty confident about, but we're also going to refine them after the funding notice comes out, and we'll make that available to you at that time. But we want to be, you'll want to be explicit and specific about how your project is going to advance the core program value. So obviously connectivity, thinking about destinations, thinking about places, but also multimodal. I know not everywhere has a lot of transit to point to, but just as an example, if you can show how your project is going to make walking, biking, and transit work together better to enable people to get where they're going, that's going to speak well to your proposal. Equity, of course, is another core value to call out in your work. Then, now, because the initial pot for this program is smaller than initially intended, and we are going to grow it to where it's intended, but in this round, I want to raise three things I think will help you as an applicant with given this size. One is planning and design proposals. A little goes a long way in planning and design in seeding future opportunities. So by legislation, there's a required $3 million minimum in this round for awards to planning and design, but I would not be at all surprised to see federal highways do many more than that because they're bound to want to touch a good number of communities in this round with the limited dollars. A second thing is leverage. So your program, the program is intended to encourage and accelerate big visions. So when the program grows, individual grants should be large, like they are, say, under the RAISE program. But for now, Federal Highways is bound to reward proposals that promise a high impact per dollar and or leverage other investments. So that could be past, present, or future investments that achieve big things, right? And then a third thing I want to raise is phasing. So if you position your proposal as a step or steps in a progression over time, that may also help you show long-term impact, and it also could give the Federal Highway Administration some flexibility to scale a grant to address your most immediate needs. So those are some of my pieces of advice here. What we're looking at is a real unique opportunity. It's purpose-built for connectivity. It's dedicated to active transportation. It's on a bigger scale than the grants you'd normally ever see under the federal programs administered at the state or regional level, like transportation alternatives. And then and so we're going to strongly encourage you to apply. Even if you're not selected in this round, we can expect Federal Highway Administration to provide you really concrete feedback on your application. How can you improve the next time? And repeat applications should be encouraged and more successful the next time around. You'll also, in doing so, be helping show the demand for this, which will create future opportunities as we all work together to grow this program. And then because it's dedicated to active transportation, it's really going to be less subject to shifting political priorities over time as compared to, say, the multimodal programs like RAISE. So with that, I want to turn to the wonderful example of the work being done on the ground in Montana by Amanda and Jackson.
Thank you, Kevin. Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Amanda Cooley. We are based in beautiful Western Montana, and we are co-leading an effort called Parks to Passes, which is a regional initiative comprised of local government entities and their nonprofit partners. And we're all focused on an active transportation route from Butte to the Montana-Idaho border. The goal collectively is to bring cohesion to planning efforts along the Great American Rail Trail. If we can go back one slide. So Kevin touched on this, the GRT would go coast to coast when completed. For our purposes of this map, keying in on the green is completed sections of the trail. Red is sections of the trail where planning or development is underway. And gray is sections that are gaps within the current trail. You'll see in the Mountain West, there is a lot of gray. And the focus of our initiative of Parks to Passes is to start filling in the gray, filling in those trail gaps within Western Montana. So we came together last year under the opportunity to pursue regional planning funding through RAISE, and we were unsuccessful in the last RAISE cycle, but we found that we had strong alignment with the RAISE goals, and we're encouraged to reapply. So we're in the process of revamping our application at this point and pursuing RAISE funding in 2024. How we all came together as Parks to Passes is there's Missoula County, Powell County, and 4 other localities in the area. We were all doing varying levels of trail development and trail planning, but the consensus was if we could form a regional model, we could really start to address local challenges in a way where we could be good steward of our time and resources. So thinking big, thinking regionally has allowed us to promote equitable outcomes, bolster the resiliency of our efforts, and also makes for a really great hook. By having a 200+ mile active transportation goal, we've found state and federal level support. And we've also found that having a regional approach brings Department of Transportation as well as rail entities to the table they're far more receptive to it, is what we've found. And we think that's because there's so many local governments at the table. This map here is just a key in on that circle on the last map, which shows the area of Western Montana we're talking about. And for our purposes, we don't have any federally designated urban areas. So when we talk about population hubs, Butte and Missoula serve that purpose for our communities. And then when you stray away from those hubs or in between those hubs, you find less people and you also find far less infrastructure. So a huge upside for thinking regionally is we've been able to bring smaller capacity stressed communities to the table and also amplify their active transportation needs. The overall goal is to have planning continuity along this route to then be competitively positioned to pursue construction funding between and within communities. One thing we wanted to highlight today is this isn't a new idea. There's been many folks and organizations that have thought of connecting this route through active transportation from Butte to the Montana-Idaho border. But what we think has been important is, and what's freed us up to think and more importantly act regionally, is this influx of funding via the bipartisan infrastructure law. The infrastructure law has been a resurgence of collaboration. It's provided regional efforts the opportunity to get off the ground and dream big. And this isn't limited just to Western Montana, and it's not limited just to active transportation. We currently don't have a project website, but we wanted to highlight 2 organizations that we're inspired by that do, and we would encourage you to check them out. The first is Puget Sound Pacific, and the second is Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority. What's been really encouraging to Amanda and I as we've prepared for this and done our homework for the ATIIP webinar is seeing the immense benefit that separate pools of funding like ATIIP for active transportation could have for our Parks to Passes partners. So going down the road, we are excited to explore with our project team how we could tailor our individual and collective efforts to align with ATIIP while also continuing to revamp our regional RAISE application for this ongoing cycle. And just as regional ideas require a lot of behind the scenes work, so does securing the funding for those ideas. So we want to really extend our thanks to RTC for all their advocacy efforts on behalf of finding funding sources where the primary objective is active transportation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to share more about the potential of ATIIP for the work we're doing out west.
Thank you, Jackson. I'm excited to talk to you today about how programs like ATIIP can be a critical asset for trail building in our communities. So one challenge with programs like RAISE is that active transportation projects, as our project is, are viewed in a pool with all types of transportation projects, both locally and nationally. The primary benefit to ATIIP is that it's a funding source dedicated to projects that are active transportation forward, projects that provide substantial opportunities for walking and bicycling. Our project goals align with the programming of ATIIP, and applying for this funding would put us in a pool more suitably matched with other transportation projects. We wouldn't be competing against major bridge and intersection improvements. We would be competing with projects like ours. We actually had 2 projects that were awarded within the region of our project scope in the 2023 RAISE cycle. But those projects that were funded were a little bit more well-developed, were fairly new. We really kind of started this effort collectively last year. But the projects that were funded were, the active transportation was a secondary focus. There's a couple key ways that projects like ours meet the goals of ATIIP. And so I'm going to use this as maybe an example to get you thinking about ways that you can elevate your projects to the level of being ready to pursue this funding. So ATIIP is geared towards creating active transportation networks and spines that connect destinations within and between communities, which is a core concept of our project. We're creating a regional spine that will tie into a larger spine that spans the length of the United States. Montana is also exploring the reintroduction of a southern passenger rail line, and we're keenly interested in working with the project to make sure our objectives are complementary. If we can align the 2 transportation initiatives, we'll create a strong offset of carbon emissions so that we're meeting climate objectives and realizing those environmental benefits. Our regional spine connects to smaller trail networks within our communities. Missoula, Howell, and Butte all have existing trail networks that will tie into this regional spine. Missoula, where Jackson's representing, is a college town, and it has the largest population center within our project scope. Their inner-city trail network supports non-motorized commuting. We're also working to progress conversations with the Salish Kootenai because we would love to see their nation tied into this resource. That's a conversation that we're trying to approach very tactfully, and aligning that with the timeline of the grant is a challenge, but it's something that we're committed to because we want to make sure that we're inclusive and that we are really being thoughtful about how many partners and who we're collaborating with. Until we see the notice of funding opportunity for ATIIP, we won't know if we need to select a specific priority, spine versus network, but we anticipate being able to capitalize on the fact that this project encompasses both. One of the neat things about this project is that it elevates the entire region, and that's kind of what this slide will capture for you. Dedicated funding for active transportation through programs such as ATIIP will help us realize these benefits. Our project, Parks to Passes, is more than a regional trail system. It's first and foremost a funding pathway to immense local benefits. When these planning objectives are funded and completed, communities along the route will be competitively positioned to secure capital funding to remedy infrastructure divisions that have persisted since the inception of the modern highway system, enhance pedestrian accessibility in rural towns, help ensure parents can send their children out of the door with a safe route to school. So in the area where I'm representing, this will connect the east to the west side of the town, which one side is more disadvantaged and there's not a safe connection over a rail crossing. It will also reduce pedestrian fatalities along interstate and state highways. A local research group, Headwaters Economics, recently completed a study on the economic potential of the Great American Rail Trail in Montana. With Montana alone, the annual benefits are expected to be over 1 million miles traveled on the trail, $16 million in visitor spending, over 200 new jobs, and $800,000 in tax revenue. So this dedicated active transportation funding has significant community benefits that are tangible beyond just providing recreation. We appreciate the opportunity to share our project as an example of how ATIIP might work for us, in hopes that you're inspired to think about how this important funding program can work for you. As Jackson said, thank you to the Rails to Trails Conservancy for your tireless work, supporting our local efforts to create this national spine, and for your advocacy for dedicated trail funding. We hope to see viewers capitalizing on the active transportation opportunities allowed for by ATIIP and other programs funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law. This is the time to get regional efforts off the ground and dream big.
Thank you, Amanda and Jackson. Dream big. I really love that. Dedicated connectivity funding really is all about creating opportunities for communities to receive grants that are really equal to their ambitions, because ambitions in our movement have gotten to be so much grander than what they were many years ago. And so what we hope here is we're creating a program that it's going to be available far into the future, consistently there and prioritized this way because it's dedicated to active transportation, such that you can plan on it, such that you compete with like projects, and you can think about, hey, we're building a system, we have multiple gaps to fill, this is a place we can go to and address all of those gaps all at once, that are the ones that are ready to go, and then come back again later and do others as your pipeline progresses. So that's why we're so excited about this. And with that, we're going to shift to questions, and they've already started coming in. So I'm going to address one just because it's already been raised in the chat, and then I'm going to start posing questions to our panel here. So one came in asking about the, what things are eligible under the program, and there actually is already a table available on the Federal Highway Administration's website that speaks to this, and that's been put in the chat. But one thing you'll notice if you look at that chart is that it's very broad, and it has a lot of, it's very open-minded about what qualifies, and you should recognize that just because it's eligible doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the most competitive thing, right? Like, so what we discussed before about what the legislation says and what the kind of motivations and priorities are for Federal Highway Administration are really going to, be governed priorities. But there are other things you can work into your proposals as elements with the broad eligibilities you see in that chart. Okay, so that's the first question. Second question is for Amanda and Jackson. Who is the sponsor on a regional grant project? Did you create a memorandum of understanding to operate as a coalition? And how do you determine who's getting funds when it is across many jurisdictions? Is a match? Oh, there's a bunch of questions here for you, but take them as you will, right? Is a match required, and who's funding the match? So there's a compound question for you two.
Yeah. I'm glad that you asked the question because I was furiously trying to type the answer. Yes, we did create an MOA. So Powell County is a lead applicant. We chose that just because it made sense. Puget Sound to Pacific has a similar model, and they kind of went the same direction. They just chose who made sense between capacity and grant management capacity. We did create an MOA in the form of an interlocal agreement. We found the best way to do that was to make it very specific to just pursuing the grant opportunity. And then we'll create an addendum upon grant award for what those management activities look like. That interlocal agreement is signed by the six cooperating partners across our region. The way that we determine who gets funding is that Puget Sound did this similarly. We just said, throw your project in the ring. If you have a higher level design that you're asking for, if you have an area that needs a feasibility study, you put in an ask for your local jurisdiction. And then the combination of those sums is the total grant request. And fortunately for RAISE, there was no grant match required which is kind of what enabled us to pursue this. But we did have to collaborate on grant writing. And so we did have to get a small funding commitment from each partner for that.
Anything you want to add, Jackson, on the compound question? Or
I think that what I would add, so last year when we put the first raise application together, we were on an 8-week application window, and the interlocal agreement with 6 government entities was the one that took the most work, I think, within that process. And it really came down into the smaller localities like Mineral County and Granite County, and somewhat in Powell County, where in the past, often those communities are left out of the equation for a myriad of reasons. One being match, which Amanda mentioned, the other being there's a floor to some of these funding avenues. So for raise, it's $1 million. So by coming together, we were able to put enough projects in that exceeded that $1 million floor, but also to get to engage with these smaller communities through their local nonprofits. There's really well-established nonprofits in Mineral County and Granite County. So the key to success was Powell County as the lead applicant, which has an understanding of the smaller rural needs, paired with these local nonprofits and their engagement with their local governments.
Perfect, thank you. So we've got some other questions here. One is if you've applied for RAISE or for reconnecting communities, can you recycle some of that content for an ATIIP application? So maybe I'll start, and I think others here could have an opinion on this as well. So one thing to note is that those other programs are administered by the U.S. DOT's Secretary's Office, and this one's going to be administered by the Federal Highway Administration, which of course is a division of the U.S. Department of Transportation, but still a different decision maker within the department. But yes, I think that there's a lot you could borrow from the other applications, but you'll want to take a close look at the NOFO instructions, the funding opportunity instructions, and make sure you're following them. But I couldn't imagine a scenario in which the work you put into such an application wouldn't have some value as a shortcut to make these. But it will be a separate submission following separate but not unrelated instructions. But do others have a perspective on this? All right. So let's go to, there's another question, it's really almost a yes/no question about are nonprofits eligible to apply? And because this is infrastructure work, the answer is not directly so. That doesn't mean that a governmental entity that's applying couldn't be collaborating with nonprofits in ways formal and informal, but they're not one of the listed applicants in the law. Marianne, here's a question for you. It's an advocacy question. What does the future of the program look like, and how can we help in securing additional funding for future years?
I think that's a plant, actually. It's the target where we are. Thank you, whoever offered that question. When Bill passed, there's a little bit of background here. When Bill passed, before that, of course, we had a Senate version of the transportation bill and a House version of the transportation bill. ATIIP was funded at the $250 million level in the House version, not funded in the Senate version. The reason for that was because at that point, to get anything into the law in the Senate side, which was 50-50, if you recall, you needed bipartisan support. So we had to have Republicans as well as Democrats on the bill, and the Republicans were not in a position to support increasing funding for transportation. And so the deal, if you will, was that they would agree to pass the program into law, but that it would not carry any annual funding with it. And we would go through the appropriations process to seek annual funding. We weren't too worried about that because we had the $250 million coming from in the House bill, but the way the politics played out, my golly, that bill never went to conference. The House bill, the Invest Act, arrived on the Senate side. It was introduced. It was immediately substituted with the Senate version, and no money for ATIIP. So we have two strategies here. One is we did work the appropriations process. We got $45 million in FY23. We're working to increase that in 24 and get even more in 25, building toward the next reauthorization. And we don't know what the ask will be for the next when Congress takes up reconsideration of transportation law, which will be in 2026. What we do know is that both for the needs of our communities as well as for the prospects of future in Congress, we need to get that figure up through the appropriations process as high as we can. I think the place for all of y'all to focus, unless you happen to be from Mr. Quigley's district in Illinois, or I think the place of focus is with FY25. All members of Congress will shortly be opening what they call portals. And these are mechanisms that they use to communicate with their constituents about what do constituents want in the next transportation law, or what do they want in the next appropriations bill. And so we're going to be, as soon as those are open, we're going to be asking all of y'all to go into their portals or online and say, we would like to see, if it's appropriations, we would like to see $200 million funding for ATIIP in the FY25 bill. So we will alert you as to when that those portals open. And then if we're looking further down the road, we will have another ask, but that's probably at least a year off before we have that. Focus right now is for the FY25 appropriations budget, $200 million. Communicate through the portal, or if there's a meeting in your district or your state, a town hall, what have you, go to that meeting, explain the importance of the program to your member of Congress and help us get funding. That's another very effective way to have an impact.
Great. Thank you, Marianne. And one thing I'd say just in terms of our aspirations, the bill that RTC helped write that started the debate about this program was called the Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act. We asked for $500 million per year for this program. We think that's the level at which it needs to be now. And in fact, demand and the maturation of the movement might point to even bigger numbers in the future, right? So when we can't achieve that politically in these current yearly appropriation debates, but in the next reauthorization, everything's on the table. So just want to mention that aspiration.
So Kevin, looking at the trails or networks, communities that are in our Trail Nation portfolio that we work with. I know you recently did a sort of thumbnail or back of the envelope calculation as to what it would take to build out those systems that we know of are underway. And what was that figure?
Yeah, we came up from that with over $13 billion in needs from the networks we've identified. And then we also looked at the Transportation Alternatives Program and saw another $2-point-something billion in unsuccessful applications there just in the last round. So we know that there's a lot of need in the country. All right. Okay, I want to ask the next question of Jackson. So let me see where. My question scrolled down. Now I got to find it again. Sorry. Where did it go? Okay, how did the process go of collecting and arousing interest and securing commitment from the various organizations that Jackson has worked with? How did that take place?
Yeah, so last year we started at the staff level with city and county government. So that's where the conversation began, and it was focused on, we have reference points. So Butte, City of Missoula, the smaller communities to an extent, and Missoula County had recent pathways and trails planning. So we had a good understanding within those communities of interest and especially in an east-west alignment, which the Great American Rail Trail follows throughout Missoula County. So it solves our connectivity need there as well. And then a lot of the support came organically through that 8-week application window. By the end of the raise cycle last year, we had over 50 letters of support, and we had engagement through that process with the state and federal delegation. But I think probably the most important piece is when we got a no that first time, we kept going. And that resiliency piece and keeping staff involved throughout all those city county partners and engaging with state and local reps and we even found new partners like state level advocacy groups like Bike Walk Montana, more of a presence from the Forest Service in Mineral County. So it's been just this strategy of this initial upstart last year, which brought with it a lot of, it launched off past support that we knew we had through these existing plans. It brought in new support, especially politically. And then over the last year, we've just been trying to reinforce that as we revamp this application.
Okay, great. I'm going to do rapid fire on a few good questions about exactly how this works. One, and how it relates to other programs. So one was, I got the questioner said, I got a transportation alternatives grant in the last year. Could I be eligible to apply for another segment through this program? And I believe the answer, I mean, obviously FHWA would have to do the formal ruling, but I think the answer to that is it should in fact be just fine to apply to both programs. It's just you wouldn't be able to use this as your federal match for the other, like it wouldn't be circular reference to each other. But if you're talking about separate segments of a network and applying for each in the same year, I don't see any problem doing that. Has anybody got a different take on that question? Okay. Another question has to do, actually, there are two questions that relate to data analysis for mobility. And so one of them is about, well, is there a way for us to calculate mode shift? You got any tools for that? For our application. So with that, let me start and then see if anybody else has thoughts, which is RTC developed a tool called Bikeable. This is not off the shelf, like available on our website and just easily, done at home, if you will, but it is a methodology for modeling some of what you get out of creating connectivity in terms of connecting destinations to where people are. So, I think there are some other organizations, consulting firms and what have you, who have some tools along those lines. That being said, I don't think, absent that, you should have any problem turning in an application where you just have a strong narrative case for the connectivity you're creating, right? Like if you're really clear that the segments you're building will connect people to, what will it connect people to? How many people and what are the demographics of people in proximity to those assets that you're developing and what have you. I think you can put a pretty strong case forward without necessarily doing the modeling. But are there other thoughts on this question?
One thought that I have is going back to the non-motorized pilot program. There were 4 communities, and each community was different, and they spent their investment somewhat differently. It was all about building a system, but what was needed in each community differed. So, and each community differed from each other community. So that report is on the FHWA website. You might go back and look at which report or which community is the most similar to yours, and then look at the mode shift that was accomplished with the investment, because that's all there. And so you might then use that as a reference point, which is we have it in mind. This is similar to what was done in Marin County or Sheboygan County, whatever, and they had a mode shift of this amount. And so we would, could perhaps, we're thinking we can replicate that with this grant.
Mm-hmm. All right, here's another question about walking, biking, and transit working together. And we're kind of interested in, I guess the questioner is interested in a little bit more thinking about, how that might work and whether a grant through this program could be used to maybe inventory some of that. So my thought on that would be, I don't see why you couldn't. I do think that there would be an attractiveness to FHWA of a concentration on how those modes are going to work together. First and last mile connectivity from to transit and from transit to ultimate destinations. And given that planning and design, planning is part of the program, I don't see why there couldn't be an effort to really document all the opportunities there as part of a project. Any other thoughts on that? I mean, I'm just projecting my own thinking based on what I know there, but.
And that's what I can do as well. I would say that there's actually a pretty high need for best practices to be developed here. It's something that we're keenly interested in. And some of the themes that are coming out in the chat have to do with, okay, well, you know, what types of transit are allowed in these alternative modes? And, you know, what about things like winter maintenance? And so with our planning grant application, we are building in funding to explore what that will look like. My sense is that it will be a little bit different in each region. Montana, I would be really surprised if we found a way to plow all of these miles of trail in the winter. It's just going to be, some of these are just going to have to work with that. But we are also keenly interested in being able to really serve the needs of the people that are in our region. We have a lot of horseback riders. And we also, like I mentioned, have the passenger rail that's going to be going in. And so we want to try and figure out the best way to align these priorities. It makes sense to have them in parallel, you know, with your highway system, and the rail line often parallels that, and the route of the Great American Rail Trail kind of parallels that. But my sense is that I'm seeing a need for some best practices to emerge. And so I hope to start seeing that as we have more of these projects funding.
Good point. All right. All right, this is a long question. Let me see if I can't get to the nub of it here. This one concerns how there's usually need cooperation from local public works departments to apply and manage grants and what have you. And there's a sort of maybe a sort of a question thought that separating active mobility from other kinds of infrastructure projects could help public works departments see that this is a mode of its own and not really in competition with their road priorities. But then it says there's a zero-sum factor regarding public works staff time to apply and manage. So how can we address that is the question, and can nonprofits play some role on the capacity end? Anyway, that's that question. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would encourage the person that asked that question to reach out to Puget Sound and Pacific, because their model is a bit different. So in Western Montana, we had engagement from staff level and local governments. Puget Sound and Pacific has that engagement through local governments, but they started with nonprofits. And so they built out a really strong advocacy and also funding arm to get to a successful raise application. So that's the quickest way to an answer. Reach out to Puget Sound and Pacific.
Okay.
I love this though. I think it's an important question to consider, and it's something that we think about a lot. Like, how can we combine priorities and capacity, especially for rural areas? I mean, that's a major sticking point for us. Our public works department doesn't want anything to do with parks and trails management. And so we're actually currently looking on collaborating at the city-county level to try and alleviate some of that and distribute some of that. But it's a good question. It's all about just starting those conversations locally, finding out what the problems are and what your resources are. So absolutely, I think for us in rural areas, at least, I work extensively with nonprofits to help extend my capacity. We actually I have a meeting with a land trust agency that may be able to help us do some park management. So, I mean, that's how I think we've been fairly successful, is we just ask people a lot of questions and make a lot of phone calls and lean into the people that we know.
Again, going back to the pilot program, one of the things we found out there, it's really important to involve your public works department from the very beginning, so that they don't feel like this is being done and then foisted upon them. And as a matter of fact, one of the communities selected as their representative to our national group, their head of their public works department. And he then became sort of interactive with some of the other communities' public works departments, and that helped a lot too. But it was just really key to have them involved right from the get-go.
Right. There's someone requested some more examples of spines. Of course, we've given this very grand, example of the Great American Rail Trail. But Marianne, I know you always have, a number of treasured projects in mind. What might you want to mention there to help people kind of solidify in their minds what's maybe a more typical example of a spine.
Well, of course, a spine can be big spine or a little spine. The Katy Trail going across Missouri is one of our, incredibly wonderful spine trails. But then here I live in Alexandria, Virginia, and in our Northern Virginia suburban region, we have the WNOD, the Washington Old Dominion Trail, and that connects a number of suburban communities going along the trail and reaches actually almost into rural Virginia now. So a spine is really anything that starts to connect discrete communities, particularly if they have discrete governing bodies. I mean, that's one of the ways that I think about it. On the other hand, we've got, right now, we've got a group down in East Tennessee in the mountains that are trying to build a spine trail to connect their community to community in Virginia, to the Virginia Creeper. So it's just a series of, it could be a big spine, like I say, a long spine. And we haven't really got a good definition for what distinguishes a spine from a non-spine. Is every trail a spine, Kevin? Do you care to answer that? Is every trail in its own, in some way, a spine?
No, I'd say it'd have to be at least between two communities to be a spine. If it's all intra to a community, then no.
I think from a governmental perspective, they are looking for government unit to government unity, but we know on a community level, sometimes it's neighborhood to neighborhood, connecting neighborhoods. Sure. So,
yeah, which can be a critical part of a network within a community. It's just not, it doesn't get the spine designation at that point. Okay, so we have, we're getting down to about 5 minutes before we will do our closing. So I'm trying to see which other questions are coming in. So one is about whether land acquisition and right-of-way is covered. And that's going to be, in the end, an FHWA decision. My predilection would be that they might consider that part of an overall strategy. It might be a pretty tough fit as kind of the leading edge of a proposal. But I am speculating at that point. Anybody else have a read on that? No.
I would agree with you. There's also a question about if the land has to be acquired prior to the grant being written or applied for. So I would say with that, it may not need to be acquired. So, we're looking at this regional feasibility study. Much of that land has not been acquired at all. I think it would probably depend a little bit on your scope. If you're looking for a pretty small scale project where the landowners are fairly clearly defined, you'll at least want to demonstrate that you have had conversations with them and that you're developing a relationship and that there might be a favorable outcome. We do have a project within our scope that is trying to negotiate this piece. And it's pretty challenging. It's a really challenging piece of trail building. And we brought lots of different resources into helping to solve that problem. But no, especially at the planning grant stage, we don't need to have all of the land secured. So it depends just kind of, I think, on your project scope and then also where you're at in your project development.
Yep. All right. So here's a question. Sorry, was there another thought? Okay. Can we apply for funding for constructing only part of a network? Absolutely is the answer to that. Is the program going to follow Justice 40 guidelines? I think we're going to have to look at the NOFO to know exactly how they deal with that. But of course, FHWA is part of the federal government. This is an administration priority. I can't imagine that it isn't going to factor into how they think about the equity elements of this program. But I don't. We don't yet know the specifics about how they're going to do that. So that'll be something we provide further thoughts on after the funding offer comes out. And Matt, there's a question about match. So the high poverty jurisdictions could get 100% of their project application covered by ATIIP. Other jurisdictions are subject to normal match guidelines, which are typically 20% state or local match to match 80% federal money. And so that's something we know is challenging. I think it'd be a good idea for us to have a whole webinar on just that topic, not just for this program, because we know that it comes up virtually every day in our work. It's a challenge. So with that, any parting thoughts from the panelists before we hand this back over to Isabel to close us out?
Well, I just want to say how much I appreciate Amanda and Jackson, who have emerged as these incredible partners in the state of Montana, doing such fantastic work and pioneering, not just how we close our gaps on the Great American Rail Trail, but how we pursue these funding opportunities. So it's really very, very special.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being with us, and thank you to everybody for tuning in. It's been I've learned a lot from our friends from Montana, and really appreciate the great questions we had coming in today. Isabel, do you want to?
All right, yeah, quickly to close us out, we at RTC are thrilled to spotlight an RTC initiative, the Trail Nation Collaborative. This is a learning community where advocates, public leaders, and professionals can come together to share their experiences, challenges, and their strategies for accelerating the pace of connecting trails and active transportation infrastructure, a lot of what we've talked about here today. If you are interested in learning more about or joining the collaborative, links will be in the chat and the follow-up email. And then that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank our presenters, Amanda and Jackson, and our RTC staff, Marianne and Kevin, for sharing their knowledge and experience today. As a reminder, there will be a follow-up email with the presentation, links that were mentioned in today's session, and a recording of the session today. So I want to thank all of you for joining us, and have a great day.